Midnight. Frost glints on the slates of a quiet English manor. A single deliberate tap, tap, tap crosses the roof above Miss Jane Marple's bedroom. No wind, no rats. Human footsteps. By dawn, a ladder no one owns, a woman's glove scented with violets, and a whispered warning. Danger on the roof. A scarred stranger checks into the village inn. A terrified widow guards a secret worth £20,000 hidden in a chimney. A desperate maid is promised salvation if she walks the ridge one more time. Tonight, Miss Marple sets a trap with an empty dispatch box and a silver-haired smile. One wrong step, and the roof will betray them all. Agatha Christie's cleverest sleuth. One village, one midnight. Zero mercy. Chapter 1. The quiet village of Willowbrook. The train from London deposited Miss Jane Marple at the little halt of Willowbrook Junction precisely at 23 minutes past 4 on a raw November afternoon. A porter there was only one touched his cap and lifted down her modest valise and the wicker basket that contained her knitting. The air smelled of coal smoke and damp leaves. Somewhere a bonfire smoldered, sending up a thin blue haze that clung to the hedgerows. Miss Marple adjusted her spectacles and surveyed the platform. It was empty save for a boy in a postman's cap wheeling a bicycle laden with parcels. No motor car awaited her. Mrs. Bantry had written that the chauffeur was laid up with influenza, and the pony trap would suffice. Sure enough, a sturdy cob stood between the shafts outside the booking hall, steam gently rising from its flanks. The groom, a taciturn youth named Ted, greeted her with a nod and stowed her luggage beneath the seat. The road into Willowbrook wound between high banks starred with the last pale clumps of Michaelmas daisies. Cottages of mellow brick peeped above clipped yew hedges. Here and there a lantern already glowed behind lace curtains. The village shop its window crowded with tins of biscuits, boot polish, and a single pyramid of Cox's orange pippins had closed for the day. Only the Red Lion showed signs of life. A flicker of firelight, the clink of glasses, the low murmur of men's voices. The laurels stood a little apart, beyond the common, where sheep grazed among the mounds of gorse. It was a square, comfortable house of the Regency period, its stucco flaking gently like old icing sugar. Ivy masked the lower windows. The upper ones stared blankly across the frost-bitten lawn. Ted drew up at the porte-cochere, jumped down, and rang the bell. The door opened almost at once, revealing Mrs. Bantry in a quilted dressing gown of violet plum, her hair in curling pins beneath a net. "Jane, my dear, you are perished. Come in. Come in. Gladys, take Miss Marple's coat." Colonel Bantry is in the study pretending to balance accounts, but really reading The Sporting Life. Tea in 5 minutes. The hall smelled of beeswax and chrysanthemums. A grandfather clock ticked with ponderous authority. Miss Marple surrendered her outdoor things and followed her hostess through baize doors into the drawing-room. A coal fire blazed. The chintz covers were faded but clean. On the sofa reposed an elderly Pekingese who raised one languid eyelid and subsided again. Mrs. Bantry rang for fresh hot water. "You find us quite in the wilds," she said, settling opposite her guest. "No bridge club this week, Mrs. Price Ridley. Has the most dreadful cold, and the vicar's sermon last. Sunday was 28 minutes by my watch. Still, one is thankful for small mercies. No burglars, no scandals, not even a village feud worth the name." Miss Marple accepted a cup of tea strong, fragrant, exactly as she liked it, and added a slice of lemon. "Peaceful places have their own dramas, Dolly. One has only to observe." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "You and your observing. You will find nothing more exciting here than Gladys dropping the best crown derby. Though I own the roof has been giving trouble. Slates coming adrift in the wind. Colonel swears he will climb up himself one of these days, but of course he never will." Outside, dusk deepened. The fire settled into ruby caves. The Pekingese snored. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she worked on a baby's jacket in pale primrose wool. She listened to the small sounds of the house, the creak of floorboards overhead as Gladys turned down beds, the muffled clatter of saucepans from the kitchen, the Colonel's cough in the study. All was orderly, all was tranquil. Yet as the clock on the mantel struck 6, Miss Marple paused in her knitting. Somewhere, very faintly, she had heard another sound, a scrape, as of a boot on tile, directly above the ceiling rose. She glanced upward. The ornate plaster showed no crack, no tremor. Mrs. Bantry, deep in an account of the new curate's unfortunate habit of addressing the Almighty as Sir, noticed nothing. Miss Marple resumed her stitches. One did not, after all, mention footsteps on the roof before one had even unpacked. Chapter 2. The First Footfall. The house settled into its nightly hush with the precision of a well-wound clock. By 11 o'clock the kitchen fire was raked out, the bolts shot home, and the Pekingese, whose name was Chung, curled into his basket with a sigh that suggested the day had been altogether too taxing. Colonel Bantry had retired to his dressing-room to wrestle with a stubborn collar stud. Mrs. Bantry, fortified by a cup of Ovaltine, had climbed the stairs with the deliberate tread of one who intends to sleep the moment her head touches the pillow. Gladys, the maid, could be heard humming "The Rose of Trelay" as she turned off the lights along the upper corridor. Miss Marple, however, was wakeful. The guest-room allotted to her faced the back of the house, overlooking the stable yard, and beyond it, the long slope of the common. The bed was comfortable, the sheets aired to perfection, yet sleep deluded her. She attributed it to the change of London water was notoriously hard, but in truth her mind was occupied with the small, apparently trivial happenings of the afternoon. The porter's remark that the 3.47 from town had carried only 3 passengers besides herself. The groom Ted's sidelong glance when she asked whether the roof had indeed been giving trouble. The faint, acrid smell of kerosene that had clung to the hall carpet long after the lamps were lit. She rose, slipped her feet into quilted slippers, and drew the curtains aside. The moon, 3 days past the full, rode high in a sky washed clean by the afternoon's wind. Silver light lay across the lawn, turning the frost to a crust of diamonds. The roof of the coach-house opposite showed every slate distinct, every chimney-pot sharp as a sentinel. Nothing moved. Even the sheep on the common had bedded down in hollows among the gorse. Miss Marple was on the point of returning to bed when the sound came, a soft, measured tread directly above her head. Tap, tap. Not the random creak of contracting timber, not the patter of a mouse behind the wainscot. These were deliberate footfalls, light but unmistakable, crossing the leads from the direction of the main chimney stack toward the gable that overhung the scullery. She counted them. 1, 2, 3. 12 in all before. They ceased as abruptly as they had begun. Then silence, deeper than before, as though the night itself held its breath. Miss Marple did not cry out. She had never been one for hysterics. Instead, she reached for the dressing-gown that hung on the chair-back serviceable navy wool, purchased in the January sales at Army and Navy, and knotted the cord with the neatness she applied to everything. Her torch, a slim ever-ready with a reassuring weight, lay on the bedside table. She slipped it into her pocket. The door opened without a sound. She had tested the hinges that afternoon with a drop of sewing machine oil, and she stepped into the corridor. The upper landing was carpeted in a faded turkey runner that swallowed the sound of her slippers. Moonlight slanted through the fanlight above the stairs, laying pale bars across the wallpaper's pattern of cabbage roses. Mrs. Bantry's door stood ajar. From within came the faint, comfortable whistle of her breathing. The Colonel's room was at the far end, beyond the linen cupboard. No light showed beneath the door. Gladys slept in the attic, reached by a secondary stair. Miss Marple paused outside the baize door that led to the servants' quarters. No sound. She descended the main staircase with the caution of long practice, avoiding the third tread, which always sighed like a disappointed dowager. In the hall, the grandfather clock showed 26 minutes to 12. Its pendulum swung with ponderous solemnity. The front door was secured by 2 bolts and a Chubb lock. The garden door, she knew, had been fastened by Gladys after the scullery was scrubbed. Yet someone or something had walked the roof not 5 minutes earlier. She turned the key in the garden door, easing it back on well-oiled hinges, and stepped onto the terrace. The cold struck through her dressing gown like a blade. Frost glittered on the stone balustrade. Her breath hung in the air like smoke. Above her the roofline rose in a series of slopes and valleys, the slates pale as fish scales in the moonlight. The chimney stack she had noted from her window stood up black and solid, but to the left, where the scullery roof adjoined the main block, a narrower ridge ran like a bridge toward the laundry chimney. Nothing stirred. No silhouette showed against the sky, no ladder leaned against the wall. Yet the footprints must be their prints in the hoarfrost that would tell their own story by morning. Miss Marple moved along the terrace, keeping in the shadow of the yew hedge. The stable clock struck the 3/4 with a thin, apologetic chime. She reached the corner where the scullery projected and looked up. The guttering was old, much mended with lead patches. A thin skim of ice glinted along its edge. And there, unmistakably, a disturbance in the frost. A series of oval smudges, heel and toe, leading from the laundry chimney toward the main stack, and then curiously doubling back upon themselves for 3 or 4 paces before vanishing altogether. She studied them with the concentration she usually reserved for a difficult clue in a crossword. The prints were small, no more than a size 4, she judged, and the heel narrow, suggesting a woman's court shoe or a light dancing hump. Not the heavy tread of a man, nor the splayed outline of a laborer's boot. Moreover, the stride was short, cautious, the weight borne on the ball of the foot, as though the walker feared a loose slate. A sudden gust swept round the corner, rattling the laurel bushes. Miss Marple drew her dressing gown closer and considered practicalities. To fetch the colonel would mean noise, confusion, perhaps the erasure of the prints before they could be properly examined. To rouse Gladys was out of the question. The girl would scream and wake the entire household. No, the thing must be done quietly. She returned indoors, relocked the garden door, and mounted the stairs. In her room she lit the small green-shaded lamp on the writing table and took from her handbag a notebook bound in maroon leather. With a stub of pencil she sketched the roofline as she had seen it from the terrace, marking the position of the prints and the point at which they ceased. Then, beneath the drawing, she wrote in her neat, spidery hand, 12 steps heard, prints in frost, small, heeled, light pressure. Direction: laundry chimney to main stack, then return 3 to 4 paces. Vanish. No ladder visible. Purpose? She underlined the last word twice, closed the book, and placed it in the top drawer beneath her handkerchief sachets. Only then did she notice the faint smell that clung to the sleeves of her dressing gown. A sharp, metallic tang, not unlike the odor of the kerosene lamps in the hall, yet with an undertone of something sweeter violets, perhaps, or the ghost of a perfume. Miss Marple sat down on the edge of the bed and considered. Violets in November were unusual. The village florist had none, and the hothouses at the hall were given over to chrysanthemums. She recalled the bottle of Yardley's April violets she had seen on Mrs. Bantry's dressing table strong, old-fashioned, unmistakable. Yet Mrs. Bantry had been asleep these 20 minutes past, and her bedroom window faced the front of the house. The stable clock struck 12. Somewhere in the distance a dog barked once and was still. Miss Marple drew the curtains, turned the key in her own door, a precaution she rarely took, and climbed into bed. She did not expect to sleep, but habit was strong. Within 10 minutes her breathing had settled into the gentle rhythm that had carried her through air raids and sleepless nights in nursing homes. Yet even in sleep her mind was busy, turning over the small, apparently disconnected facts like pieces in a jigsaw. The smell of kerosene, the violet perfume, the footprints that ended in mid-air. Somewhere in the pattern lay the shape of a human motive, as clear to her trained observation as the outline of a camel in a child's puzzle picture. Outside, the moon sank behind the elms. The frost thickened on the leads. And on the roof, though no ear marked it, a single slate shifted imperceptibly, as though a weight had rested there and then been carefully removed. Chapter 3. The Household Awakens. Gladys discovered the ladder at 6:30, when she came down in her curlers and carpet slippers to riddle the kitchen range. It lay full length along the scullery wall, its rungs still beaded with frost, the paint on the uprights blistered and unfamiliar. She gave one startled yelp, dropped the coal scuttle with a clang that brought Mrs. Bantry flying from her bedroom in a puce dressing-gown, and within 5 minutes the entire household was assembled in the yard, breath pluming in the iron-cold air. Colonel Bantry, purple-faced and belted into an ancient British warm, inspected the ladder as though it were a breach of the king's regulations. "Never seen the blasted thing before in my life," he barked. "Looks fine Scandinavian pine, if I'm any judge. Who the devil left it here?" Gladys, round-eyed, could only repeat that it had not been there when she locked up at 10. The scullery window was fastened on the inside. The back door showed no sign of tampering. Yet the ladder reached exactly to the gutter above the laundry chute, and on the leads now plainly visible in daylight ran the same small, narrow prints Miss Marple had noted in the moonlight. They crossed to the main ridge, hesitated beside the base of the great chimney, then returned as far as the skylight over the box-room, before vanishing utterly. Mrs. Bantry clutched her throat. "Burglars! I knew it. My sapphires, oh my sapphires!" She bolted indoors, the Pekingese yapping at her heels, and was heard thumping up the stairs 2 at a time. Miss Marple, who had descended fully dressed in a dove-gray wool with a cameo brooch at the throat, followed more sedately. She found her hostess on her knees before the dispatch box in the attic, the lid thrown back to reveal nothing more lethal than a stack of Colonel Bantry's unpaid bills. "Safe?" asked Mrs. Bantry, sinking back on her heels. But how can one feel safe with persons unknown capering about the roof at midnight? Colonel Bantry, who had followed with the 12-bore under his arm, snorted. "Capering be blowed. Professional job. Roof walker seen am in India. Cool as cucumbers. Walk the ridgepole for a bet. After the silver, I'll be bound." Miss Marple said nothing. She was examining the skylight. The catch was stiff with disuse, the paint undisturbed, yet a faint smear of soot darkened the brass. She opened her notebook and added a line beneath last night's entry. "Skylight not forced. Soot on catch inside or out. Breakfast was a scratch of fair eggs boiled too hard, toast singed, coffee weak from nervous measuring." Gladys kept darting to the window. The colonel glowered at his kippers. Mrs. Bantry recounted the history of the sapphires, left to her by an aunt who had married a tea planter, until her husband begged her to hold her tongue. Miss Marple ate sparingly and observed. At 9:15, Constable Polk arrived on a bicycle that appeared too small for his bulk. He was a slow-spoken young man with a complexion like a harvest apple and a notebook that refused to lie flat. He listened to the colonel's bellowed theories, Mrs. Bantry's agitated recapitulations, and Gladys's breathless interpolations without visible emotion. When at last he turned to Miss Marple, she spoke quietly. "The prints are a woman's, constable size 4, narrow heel, light pressure. The ladder is new. Note the sawdust still clinging to the rungs. And there is a smell faint but persistent of violet scent and paraffin. You will find the same combination, I fancy, on the glove dropped in the laurels last week." Polk blinked. "Glove, ma'am?" "In the shrubbery by the tennis court. Pale gray kid, left hand, slightly soiled at the tip. Mrs. Bantry believed it belonged to a bridge guest, but the owner has not claimed it." The constable scratched his chin. I'll look into it. Meanwhile, sir, to the colonel, I'll telephone the station for a man to keep watch tonight. No sense taking chances. Watch be damned, said the colonel. I'll sit up myself with the gun. Mrs. Bantry gave a small shriek. Miss Marple merely requested that the ladder be left exactly where it lay until the prints on the roof could be photographed. Hawk promised to send for the police camera, though his tone suggested the apparatus was more usually employed for road accidents than nocturnal perambulations. After the constable had pedaled away, Mrs. Bantry insisted on a council of war in the morning room. The fire smoked. The Pekingese sneezed. The colonel cleaned his shotgun with unnecessary violence. Miss Marple sat beside the window, her knitting needles moving with meditative rhythm. Someone, she said at last, wished to enter or to appear to enter this house from the roof. The ladder was placed after the household retired, yet before the frost formed thickly, say between 10:30 and 11:15. The walker was familiar with the lie of the slates. No tile was dislodged. That argues practice. Moreover, the prints cease at the skylight. Either our visitor entered there, and the catch shows no sign of forcing, or he was lifted off the roof at that point. Lifted? Mrs. Bantry's voice rose to a squeak. By a rope, perhaps, or a second ladder from the far side. The box-room skylight opens onto the lower slope above the billiard room. A Confederate could lower a line, draw the walker across, and remove all trace from this side. The frost would hide the rest. The colonel slapped his knee. By Jove, that's it. Gang of London Crook's roof men heard about Dolly's jewels. Planned to hoist the swag over the ridge and down the other side into a waiting car. Devilish cunning. Miss Marple inclined her head. Possible, certainly. Yet one asks oneself why they rehearsed the route so openly. A professional thief prefers silence and invisibility. These footsteps were meant to be heard. Mrs. Bantry stared. Meant? You mean someone wishes us to believe in burglars? I mean, said Miss Marple gently, that the sapphires may not be the quarry at all. Consider, the prints are a woman's. The scent is a woman's. The glove is a woman's. Yet the strength required to place that ladder unaided argues a man or two persons acting in concert. We have, therefore, a puzzle with at least three pieces. A woman who walks roofs, a man who lifts ladders, and a third who profits by the alarm created. She laid her knitting aside. The baby jacket was growing apace. The primrose wool looked almost white in the thin morning light. Mrs. Bantry shivered. It's uncanny. I shan't sleep a wink tonight. You will sleep in the blue room, said the colonel decisively, and I'll have the dog on the landing. Anyone trying the roof again will get a charge of number 6 in the breeches. Miss Marple picked up her needles once more. Let us hope, Arthur, that number 6 is not required. Violence is so rarely the answer to a problem of this sort. Observation, patience, and a little understanding of human nature. These are the tools that serve best. Outside, the sun climbed a watery sky. The frost began to melt from the leads, erasing the delicate tracery of prints as though it had never been. But in Miss Marple's notebook, the sketch remained, and beneath it a new line in her precise handwriting. Object, not theft, but terror or misdirection. Whose nerves are to be shaken, and why? Chapter 4. The Stranger at the Inn. The Red Lion stood foursquare to the wind at the junction where the Willowbrook Road met the broader highway to Market Basing. Its brick was the color of ripe cherries. Its signboard, newly gilded, showed a lion rampant that looked more like a worried tabby. By 2 o'clock, the public bar was empty save for the landlord polishing glasses, and a single commercial traveler nursing a half-pint of mild and bitter. Miss Marple, who had walked down under the pretext of posting a letter, chose a table near the fire and ordered a glass of milk. The landlord, Mr. Pickett, brought it himself. He was a thin man with a drooping mustache, and the resigned air of one who has heard every possible excuse for not settling a slate. Quiet today, Miss Marple observed, stirring in a lump of sugar. Always is, midweek. Market day's Thursday. Though we've a stranger in the commercial arrived last evening, paid cash, keeps himself to himself. Mr. Pickett lowered his voice. Name of Lemisol, or so he signed the book. Foreign by the sound. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes rested on the register lying open, beside the till. The entry was in a sloping continental hand. Our Lemisol, London. The address had been left blank. Traveling in what? She inquired. Didn't say. Car's a dark saloon Humber. I think parked round the back. Mud to the sills. Been places. The door to the private parlor opened, and the stranger himself appeared. He was tall, well above 6 feet, dressed in a town overcoat of impeccable cut. A scar, livid against the olive skin, ran from the corner of his left eye to the hinge of the jaw. He glanced once at Miss Marple, dismissed her as harmless, and addressed the landlord in a voice that carried the faintest trace of an accent South American, perhaps, or Central European. Telephone? Through there, sir. Local calls twopence. The man nodded and disappeared into the booth. Miss Marple sipped her milk. Through the frosted glass she could see the silhouette of his head and shoulders. The receiver was cradled against his ear with the ease of habit. He spoke for perhaps 3 minutes, hung up, and came out adjusting his cuffs. Mr. Pickett ventured a civility. All right for dinner, sir. Roast beef and Yorkshire. Excellent. The stranger's smile did not reach his eyes. He dropped a coin on the counter and went out by the side door. A moment later the Humber purred into life and moved off toward the common. Miss Marple finished her milk, left 6pence beneath the saucer, and followed at a leisurely pace. The car had stopped beside the telephone kiosk opposite the post office. Lemisol was inside, dialing again. She noted the number Willowbrook 27 before crossing the road to the stationer's, as though in search of stamps. From the doorway she watched him speak rapidly, hang up, and drive away in the direction of the hall. The postmistress, Miss Hartnell, was wrapping a parcel of wool for the district nurse. She greeted Miss Marple with the enthusiasm of one starved for gossip. That foreign gentleman asked for the laurels not 10 minutes ago. I told him straight, Mrs. Bantry's particular who she sees. He just laughed and said it was business. Business, Miss Marple repeated thoughtfully. How curious. She purchased a penny stamp she did not need and walked back through the village. At the crossroads she paused to admire a display of chrysanthemums in the window of Monrepo's, the neat villa occupying Mrs. Evelyn Forsyth. The curtains twitched. A pale face appeared for an instant and vanished. Miss Marple made a mental note and continued to the laurels. Mrs. Bantry was in the morning room, dictating letters to Gladys, who wrote in an agonized long hand. The Pekingese lay on the hearthrug, dreaming of rabbits. Jane, you'll never guess, Mrs. Bantry burst out. A note delivered by hand not half an hour ago. Look. She thrust forward a single sheet of cheap blue paper. The message, printed in block capitals, was brief. Keep your doors locked. Danger on the roof. No signature. The envelope bore no stamp. Miss Marple turned it over. The paper was the sort sold in packets at the stationer's. The ink, Quiller's blue-black, common as tap water. She sniffed delicately nothing. Yet the warning chimed with last night's events, like a second bell in a chime. Gladys found it on the hall table, Mrs. Bantry continued. No one saw who left it. The colonel's in a frightful temper, says he'll shoot the next person who mentions roofs. Miss Marple folded the note and slipped it into her handbag. Have you shown it to Constable Pauck? Not yet. He's coming at 4 to measure the ladder again. Really, Jane, it's too much. First footprints, then ladders, now anonymous letters. What next? Next, said Miss Marple calmly, we discover who benefits by your alarm. Fear is a powerful weapon, Dolly. Someone wishes you to look in one direction while the true business is conducted in another. She took up her knitting. The primrose jacket now boasted a sleeve. The stitches marched in perfect formation. Mrs. Bantry stared. You talk as though it's all a game. Human beings are not so very different from crossword puzzles, Miss Marple replied. The clues are there if one knows how to read them. Consider the stranger at the inn, the telephone calls, the note, the woman's glove, the scent of violets. Somewhere in that pattern lies a motive as old as the hills greed, perhaps, or revenge, or the simplest of all, the desire to possess what another values. The grandfather clock struck 3. Outside, the Humber saloon glided past the gate and turned into the drive of Monrepos. Miss Marple's needles paused for a fraction of a second. Mrs. Bantry followed her gaze. That's Evelyn Forsythe's house. Whatever can he want there? Information, possibly, said Miss Marple. Or confirmation. Mrs. Forsythe was in Buenos Aires before her marriage, was she not? And her late husband had a partner, a man who disappeared after some financial embarrassment. Mrs. Bantry's jaw dropped. How on earth do you know these things? My dear, one hears, and one remembers. A scar is a distinctive thing, so is a name like Lemisel. I think, Dolly, that we should invite Mrs. Forsythe to tea. Tomorrow, perhaps. And we must ask her to bring her bridge scorecards. She is so very particular about them. Mrs. Bantry looked bewildered, but obeyed. Miss Marple resumed her knitting. In the quiet interval before Constable Pauk's arrival, she added 2 more lines to her notebook. Stranger equals our Lemisel. Calls to Willowbrook 27, Monrepos. An unknown second number. Note delivered between 1:30 and 2 p.m. Paper local, Ink common. Object of alarm still obscure. The fire settled with a small avalanche of coal. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock struck the quarter. Miss Marple's mild eyes rested on the flames, but her thoughts were on scarred faces, violet perfume, and the precise angle at which a ladder must lean to reach the gutter above the scullery. Chapter 5. The second night. Constable Pauk arrived at dusk with the earnest air of a man who has been issued a truncheon and a whistle, and is determined to justify both. He carried a bull's-eye lantern, a length of clothesline, and the conviction that all criminals are fools. Colonel Bantry met him in the hall with the 12-bore already broken across his arm. "Hide yourself in the laurels, my lad," the colonel instructed. "First sign of movement on the tiles, flash your light and shout. I'll be on the terrace with the gun." Pauk looked doubtful. "Begging your pardon, sir, but firearms." "Number 6 shot," said the colonel cheerfully. "Won't kill anyone, but it'll sting like the devil. Off you go." Miss Marple, who had been arranging chrysanthemums in the drawing-room, laid down her scissors. "If I might suggest, Arthur, the constable would be better placed in the box-room. The skylight commands the entire ridge. A shout from there will carry to the terrace, quite as well as from the garden." The colonel harumphed, but conceded the point. Pauk was dispatched upstairs with a thermos of cocoa and a cushion for his knees. Gladys was sent to bed with a hot water bottle and strict instructions to lock her door. Mrs. Bantry, fortified by a dose of sal volatile, declared her intention of sitting up with her husband. Miss Marple merely requested that the garden door be left on the latch. "Someone must be free to move about the house," she explained, "without the noise of unbolting. I shall remain in my room with the window open a crack. Sound carries upward on a still night." The clock was set forward 5 minutes Mrs. Bantry's stratagem for ensuring punctuality, and by 11 the household was disposed like pieces on a chessboard. The colonel took post behind the stone urn at the foot of the steps. Mrs. Bantry stationed herself in the morning-room, with Chung on her lap and a poker within reach. Pauk crouched in the box-room among trunks and mothballs. Miss Marple sat by her bedroom window, shawl about her shoulders, knitting needles idle for once. The night was windless, the sky overcast. No moon silvered the slates. The roof lay in dense shadow, broken only by the faint glow from the village street lamp at the end of the lane. Frost had formed again, crisp and white. Somewhere a vixen screamed. An owl answered from the spinney. 11:30. The grandfather clock in the hall gave its preliminary wheeze, and struck the half-hour. Miss Marple's ears, attuned to every creak of the old house, registered the small sounds. The Colonel shifting his weight on the gravel, Pock clearing his throat 2 floors above, the Pekingese dreaming aloud in the morning room. 11:45. A board creaked on the main stair. Gladys, perhaps, unable to sleep. Then silence. 11:50. The stable clock chimed the 3/4 with its thin, apologetic note. At 5 minutes past 12, the footsteps began again, lighter than before, quicker, almost a patter. They crossed the ridge above the scullery with the confidence of long practice, paused beside the chimney, then moved toward the skylight. Miss Marple leaned forward. In the darkness she could see nothing, but she heard the scrape of a boot on lead, the soft intake of breath as someone balanced on the narrow gutter. Pock's lantern flashed, a sudden white beam cutting the night like a sword. The figure on the roof was caught for an instant, slight, dark-clad, a scarf wound about the head. It darted sideways, slipped on the frosty slate, and for one heart-stopping moment hung suspended by its hands from the guttering. A muffled cry, half-gasp, half-sob escaped the scarf. Then the figure dropped, landing with a crash in the laurel bush below. Pock's shout, "Stop! Police!" rang out belatedly. The Colonel's gun roared. Number 6 shot pattered through the leaves like hail. Mrs. Bantry screamed from the morning room. Chang burst into frenzied yapping. Miss Marple was already at the garden door. She stepped onto the terrace as the Colonel blundered through the shrubbery, torch beam jerking wildly. Pock thumped down the back stairs 2 at a time. The laurel bush shook. A darker shape detached itself and vanished into the shadows beyond the tennis court. "After him!" bellowed the Colonel, crashing in pursuit. Pock followed, boots crunching on frost. Their torches bobbed like will-o'-the-wisps across the lawn and disappeared over the ha-ha. Miss Marple did not join the chase. She moved to the laurel and parted the branches with care. The frost was broken where the figure had fallen. A scrap of dark cloth clung to a twig, and on the ground, half buried in leaf mold, lay a single glove-pale gray kid, left hand, faintly scented with violets. She picked it up with her handkerchief and slipped it into her pocket. Then she stood listening. The shouts of the pursuers grew fainter. A car engine coughed into life on the far side of the common and receded toward the London road. Silence returned, broken only by the drip of melting frost from the eaves. Mrs. Bantry appeared in the doorway, hair in pins, face chalk-white. "Jane, are you all right? Did they catch him?" "No one was caught," Miss Marple replied, "but something was left behind. Come indoors, Dolly. You will take cold." They returned to the morning room. The fire had sunk to embers. Chang had subsided into sulky growls. Miss Marple poured a glass of water from the carafe and handed it to her friend. "Drink this. You will feel better." Mrs. Bantry obeyed, then stared at the glove Miss Marple laid on the table. "That's Evelyn Forsyth's. She wore the pair on Tuesday, complained one was missing after bridge." "Exactly," said Miss Marple. "And now the second has been returned in dramatic fashion. Someone wishes us to connect Mrs. Forsyth with the events on the roof." The Colonel burst in, red-faced and triumphant. "Got clean away, blast it. Car waiting dark saloon, no lights. Pock's telephoning the county police. By George, though, we gave the beggar a fright." Pock followed, crestfallen. "Lost him in the gorse, sir. But I found this." He held out a small object, a brass button, military pattern, the shank twisted where it had been torn from a coat. Miss Marple examined it. "From a greatcoat, I fancy. The thread is Navy Surge officer's quality. Not our roof walkers, I think. The figure was slight, the fall light. This belongs to the Confederate who waited below." She added the button to the glove and the scrap of cloth. 3 pieces of a puzzle, each small, each suggestive. Mrs. Bantry sank into a chair. "I shall never sleep again. First sapphires, now gunfire. What can Evelyn possibly have to do with it? That, said Miss Marple, is what we must ask her. Tomorrow, over tea, in the most natural way possible. And we must prevail upon Constable Pauk to keep watch another night, but quietly, without the gun. Our visitors are growing bold. Boldness leads to mistakes. She picked up her knitting. The primrose wool gleamed softly in the lamplight. Outside, the frost hardened again. The laurel bush stood rigid, its secret delivered. Somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed briefly, and was still. Miss Marple's needles clicked once, twice. In her notebook she wrote, "Second visitation, 12:05 a.m., figure slight, agile, falls into laurel. Glove deliberate plant. Car escape humber. Button from accomplice. Object, to implicate EF or to force her hand." She underlined the last phrase and closed the book. The house settled around her, creaking like an old ship. But Miss Marple's eyes were bright behind her spectacles. The pattern was forming, thread by thread, and she knew the shape it would take before the skein was spent. Chapter 6. Tea and Interrogation. Mon Repos stood behind a privet hedge so neatly clipped that it might have been measured with a ruler. The gate bore a brass plate announcing the name in self-conscious italics. The path was swept, the doorstep whitened, the windows veiled by Nottingham lace so spotless that it seemed never to have known a fly. Miss Marple arrived at 20 minutes past 4, bearing a small tin of her own shortbread and the air of one who has come to borrow a knitting pattern. Mrs. Evelyn Forsythe opened the door herself. She was a slight woman in her middle 40s, dressed in dove gray with a cameo at the throat and an expression that hovered between welcome and alarm. Her hands small, well kept, the nails lacquered pearl-fluttered like trapped birds. "Miss Marple." "How kind. Do come in." "I was just this moment putting the kettle on." The drawing-room smelled of lavender polish and the particular stuffiness that comes from too many photographs in too small a space. Terriers in silver frames glared from every table. A sampler worked in cross-stitch exhorted the visitor to waste, not want not. Mrs. Forsythe indicated a chintz chair, poured tea with the concentration of a chemist titrating acid, and offered a plate of Marie biscuits arranged in a precise circle. Miss Marple accepted a cup and declined sugar. "I have come, my dear, on a rather delicate errand." "You were at the Laurels on Tuesday for bridge?" Mrs. Forsythe's teaspoon rattled. Yes, I was." "A most enjoyable evening, though Mrs. Bantry will trump her partner's ace. You left a glove behind, I believe." Pale gray kid. The color drained from Mrs. Forsythe's cheeks, leaving the rouge in 2 bright patches. "Did I? How stupid. I thought I had lost it at the Institute." "It was found," Miss Marple said gently, "in the laurel bush beneath the scullery roof. Last night." Mrs. Forsythe set her cup down with a clatter. "I don't understand, nor do I yet. But the glove was dropped by the person who walked the roof at midnight. The same person, perhaps, who left a ladder against the wall the night before. You will forgive me, but I must ask, why should anyone wish to implicate you in what appears to be an attempted burglary?" Mrs. Forsythe's hands twisted in her lap. "I have no idea. None." Miss Marple sipped her tea. It was weak, the color of straw. "Let us be practical. You possess something perhaps unknowingly that another person desires. Something small enough to be hidden in a chimney or behind a loose slate. Your late husband was in business in Buenos Aires. Was he not?" The question hung in the air like a drawn sword. Mrs. Forsythe stared at the sampler as though the faded maxim might supply an answer. "Arthur dealt in hides," she said at last. "There was a partner, Raoul Lemisel. The firm failed in the crash of '29. Arthur came home. Lemisel vanished. The bonds were never recovered. Bonds to the value of £20,000, Miss Marple supplied. Bearer bonds, easily negotiable. You told the police at the time that they had been destroyed in a fire. They were. I saw the ashes myself, yet ashes can be sifted, and memories are long. Mr. Lemisel is at present staying at the Red Lion. He arrived the day before the first footsteps were heard. Mrs. Forsythe rose and went to the window. Her reflection in the glass looked frail, almost transparent. He came here yesterday, said he had proof the bonds were hidden in this house before we left South America. Demanded I sell Mon Repos so he could search. I refused. Naturally, the house is your security. But if you were frightened, alarmed by anonymous notes, by disturbances at the Laurels, might you not be persuaded to leave? Mrs. Forsythe turned. You think he staged the whole thing? I think, said Miss Marple, that greed is a powerful motive, and fear a useful tool. The glove was meant to be found. The latter left in plain sight. The footsteps timed for maximum effect. But there is a flaw. The walker was too light, the stride too short. Mr. Lemisel is a tall man. The prints are a woman's. Therefore, he has an accomplice, someone who knows the roof of the Laurels, and is willing to risk a broken neck for a share of 20,000 pounds. Mrs. Forsythe sank back into her chair. Gladys, she whispered. She was our maid in Buenos Aires for 6 months before we sailed. She knew Arthur's habit of hiding papers in chimneys. And she is desperate for money, her mother's operation, the doctor's bills. Miss Marple nodded. Gladys is impulsive, but not clever. She would follow instructions without seeing the whole design. The scent of violets on the glove is yours, I fancy. My Yardley's. I gave her a bottle last Christmas. Exactly. A small touch of authenticity. But the button found last night military, navy serge, belongs to a man's greatcoat. Lemisel's, perhaps. The net tightens. Mrs. Forsythe's eyes filled with tears. What am I to do? Nothing yet? Leave the matter in the hands of those who understand such things. But you might lend me the duplicate key to your garden gate, and perhaps a photograph of Gladys in her Buenos Aires uniform. One likes to be sure. Mrs. Forsythe fetched the key from a drawer and a faded snapshot from an album. In it, a younger Gladys stood beside a potted palm, apron starched, eyes bold. Miss Marple slipped both into her handbag. Tonight, she said, Constable Pauk will watch again, but from inside the house. The colonel will restrain his trigger finger. And you, my dear, will lock your doors and admit no one. By morning we shall know more. She rose, smoothing her gloves. Thank you for the tea. And for the shortbread tin, I shall return it washed and filled. Mrs. Forsythe saw her to the door. The privet hedge quivered in a sudden breeze. Somewhere a gate banged. Miss Marple walked briskly down the path, the key cold against her palm, the photograph a small square of certainty in her bag. At the Laurels she found Mrs. Bantry in a state of flutter. Jane, the most extraordinary thing. Gladys has given notice. Says her mother's worse. Must go to Bournemouth at once. I've persuaded her to stay till tomorrow. But really. Miss Marple removed her hat and pinned it to the stand with care. Tomorrow will be soon enough. Tonight we set the trap, and we bait it with an empty dispatch box beneath the skylight. She opened her notebook and added a final entry for the day. E.F. confirms bonds. Gladys accomplice violets, roof knowledge, Lemisel mastermind. Plan. Alarm at the Laurels to drive E.F. from Mon Repos. Trap tonight box room, no gun. Key to M.R. gate. She closed the book, drew the curtains against the darkening sky, and allowed herself a small, satisfied smile. The pieces were almost in place. One more night would see the picture complete. Chapter 7. The Trap. The house was prepared with the meticulous care of a general's staff before battle. At 10 o'clock, a dispatch box, now empty save for a folded copy of the Times, stood directly beneath the box-room skylight, its brass lock gleaming in the lamplight. Colonel Bantry had been persuaded, with difficulty, to leave the shotgun in the gun-room and content himself with a stout blackthorn. Constable Pauk concealed himself behind a stack of cabin trunks. His bull's-eye lantern shuddered to a pinprick. Mrs. Bantry, dosed with aspirin and firm instructions, retired to the blue room with Chong and a bell rope tied to her wrist. Gladys, pale and red-eyed, was locked in the attic with a tray of cold supper and the assurance that her mother would be telephoned in the morning. Miss Marple took up her station on the first-floor landing, seated in a small tapestry chair that had belonged to Mrs. Bantry's grandmother. She wore her dark wool dressing-gown and soft felt slippers. Her knitting lay untouched on her lap. The house lights were extinguished one by one until only the faint glow from the dying kitchen fire remained. The grandfather clock struck 11 with its usual preliminary cough, then settled into the measured tick that marked the slow passage of a country night. 11:15. The stable clock chimed the quarter. 11:30. A board creaked on the attic stair, Gladys turning restlessly in her bed. 11:45. The wind rose, rattling the casements like a warning finger. At 12 precisely the footsteps began. They were lighter than on previous nights, almost soundless, yet Miss Marple's ear caught the faint scrape of rubber on slate, the soft intake of breath as the walker negotiated the ridge. The sounds moved from the scullery roof toward the main stack, paused, then crossed to the box-room skylight with the confidence of a tight-rope artiste. A gloved hand appeared at the frame, feeling for the catch. The skylight lifted an inch, 2 inches. A dark head followed, scarf-wrapped, eyes gleaming in the dimness. The figure wriggled through, dropped cat-like to the floor, and straightened. For a moment it stood listening. Then it moved toward the dispatch box. Miss Marple rose without haste. "Good evening, Mr. Lemisel," she said conversationally. "The bonds are not there. They were posted to Scotland Yard yesterday afternoon by Mrs. Forsyth herself." The man spun round. The scarf had slipped. The scar stood out livid against his skin. In the half-light he looked taller than in the inn, the town overcoat replaced by a dark sweater and rubber-soled shoes. His right hand flashed to his pocket. "I shouldn't," Miss Marple advised. "Constable Pauk is behind the trunks with handcuffs ready, and the colonel is on the stairs with a blackthorn. You are quite surrounded." Lemisel's eyes darted to the skylight, to the door, to the small silver-haired woman who blocked his path with no more than quiet certainty. He laughed suddenly, a short bark without humor. "So the old lady plays detective. Very clever. But you have no proof." "Proof enough," said Miss Marple. "The glove, the button, the ladder sawdust on your shoes red clay from the common, not local. And Gladys will talk. She is already packing. A promise of leniency will loosen her tongue wonderfully." From the landing came the thud of the colonel's boots. Pauk's lantern flared. Lemisel made one desperate lunge for the skylight, but the constable was quicker. The handcuffs clicked shut with metallic finality. Colonel Bantry arrived brandishing the blackthorn like a claymore. "Got the blighter." "By Jove, Miss Marple, you're a marvel." Lemisel stood between his captors, breathing hard. "You will regret this," he said softly. "There are others who will deny all knowledge of you," Miss Marple finished. "A wise man cuts his losses. You chose the wrong roof, Mr. Lemisel, and the wrong village. We are simple folk here, but we notice things." She opened the dispatch box and removed the Times. Beneath it lay the pale gray glove and the brass button, neatly arranged like exhibits in a museum. Lemisel stared at them, and for the first time his composure cracked. Downstairs the telephone rang Pauk's arrangements with the county police. Mrs. Bantry's voice floated up, shrill with relief. The Pekingese added a triumphant yelp. Miss Marple turned to the prisoner. "You rehearsed the route in daylight, I fancy, and betrayed yourself by perfection. A thief in haste stumbles. You walked as though on a parade ground. And the scent of violets, Gladys, overdid the authenticity. Small mistakes, but fatal." Lemisel said nothing. The fight had gone out of him. He looked suddenly older. The scar a livid brand of failure? Pock marched him down the stairs. The colonel followed, humming "The British Grenadiers" under his breath. Miss Marple closed the skylight, latched it firmly, and gathered her knitting. The primrose jacket was finished. Only the buttons remained to be sewn. In the hall, the county car waited, its engine ticking over. Lemisel was bundled into the back seat between two stolid constables. As the car moved off, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Gladys at the attic window, her face a pale oval against the darkness. Tomorrow there would be statements, tears, perhaps a reduced charge. Tonight there was only the satisfaction of a puzzle solved, and a village restored to its customary peace. Mrs. Bantry met her at the foot of the stairs, wrapper clutched about her like a toga. "Jane, you are wonderful. How did you know?" Miss Marple smiled. "One observes, Dolly, and one remembers that human nature is much the same in Willowbrook as in Buenos Aires. Greed walks softly, but always on the same old path." She poured 2 small glasses of whiskey from the decanter in the study. "To quiet roofs," she toasted. Mrs. Bantry drank, coughed, and laughed all at once. "I shall have the slates nailed down tomorrow." "Unnecessary," said Miss Marple. "The danger is over. Though I should ask the chimney sweep to examine the flues at Monrepos. One never knows what may have been hidden there in the past." The clock struck 1. The house settled around them, creaking gently like an old ship finding its moorings. Miss Marple finished her whiskey, climbed the stairs, and slept without dreaming until the maid's knock at 7:30. Chapter 8. The Explanation. The morning room at the Laurels had never known such an assembly. Sunlight, thin but determined, slanted through the windows and lay in pale bars across the Turkey carpet. Mrs. Bantry, still in her dressing gown but with her hair restored to its usual waves, presided over a laden tray, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe, eggs poached to perfection, toast cut thin as playing cards. Colonel Bantry, shaved and spruce in tweeds, attacked a kipper with relish. Constable Pock, cap in hand, stood by the door like a schoolboy summoned to the headmistress. Gladys, red-nosed and tearful, hovered on the threshold until Mrs. Bantry waved her to a chair and pressed a cup into her trembling fingers. Miss Marple sat opposite the fire, the finished primrose jacket folded neatly on her lap. She looked, as Mrs. Bantry afterwards declared, exactly like a small gray kitten that has swallowed a very large canary. "Well," began the colonel, wiping his mustache, "let's have the whole story, Miss Marple." "From the beginning." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It begins, as so many things do, with money. £20,000 in bearer bonds, to be precise. In 1929, Mr. Arthur Forsyth and his partner Mr. Raoul Lemisel were doing business in hides in Buenos Aires. The crash came. The firm collapsed. The bonds intended to cover a large shipment vanished. Mr. Forsyth maintained they had been destroyed in a warehouse fire. Mr. Lemisel believed otherwise. He believed they had been concealed by Mr. Forsyth in the chimney of the house they then occupied, and that Mrs. Forsyth, on her husband's death, had brought the secret home with her. Mrs. Bantry poured more coffee. But Evelyn swore the bonds were ashes. Exactly. And for 15 years, Mr. Lemisel accepted that, until a chance remark in a London club, perhaps, or a letter from an old employee, convinced him the hiding place had been Monrepos all along. He came to Willowbrook to buy the house. Mrs. Forsyth refused to sell. She has little enough. The villa is her security. So Mr. Lemisel devised a subtler plan, to frighten her into leaving. Gladys gave a small sob. Miss Marple regarded her with compassion. "You were the instrument, my dear. You had been maid to the Forsyths in Buenos Aires. You knew Mr. Forsyth's habit of secreting papers and flues. You were in desperate need, your mother's illness, the hospital bills. Mr. Lemisel offered you a share if you would help. First, you were to create alarm at the Laurel's footsteps, a ladder, a dropped glove, scented with Mrs. Forsyth's violets, to suggest she was involved in burglary. The anonymous note was to clinch the matter. Mrs. Forsyth, terrified of scandal, would sell Monrepos and flee. Mr. Lemisel would then search at leisure. Colonel Bantry slapped the table. Diabolical! Effective, certainly, Miss Marple continued, had it not been for small errors. The footsteps were too regular rehearsed in daylight, I suspect, when Gladys practiced the route. A real thief hurries. The glove was planted too obviously, and the ladder new pine, red clay on the rungs betrayed a journey from the common where Mr. Lemisel's car was hidden. The brass button torn from his greatcoat during the second escape was the final clue. Pauk cleared his throat. He's admitted the scheme, ma'am. Says Gladys was to get £500. Swears the bonds are still in the chimney at Monrepos. We've a man up there now with the sweep. Mrs. Bantry leaned forward. And were they? Pauk permitted himself a grin. Packet of newspaper cuttings, ma'am. Nothing more. Mr. Forsyth must have destroyed the bonds after all or cashed them quietly and never told his wife. Either way, Lemisel's wasted 15 years and a deal of ingenuity. Gladys burst into tears. He promised Mum would be all right. I never meant harm just to frighten the mistress into selling. Miss Marple laid a hand on the girl's sleeve. You have been foolish, Gladys, but not wicked. Speak the truth to the police. They will deal leniently. And your mother shall have the best care. The fund from the Women's Institute will see to that. The colonel harumphed. Damned scoundrel. Ought to be horsewhipped. Transportation would have suited him better in the old days, Miss Marple agreed. But I fancy a term in prison will cool his ardor. He will trouble Willowbrook no more. Mrs. Bantry rang for fresh toast. And the sapphires? I nearly had a fit over nothing. Your sapphires are safe in the bank, Miss Marple reminded her, though I should have the dispatch box fitted with a stronger lock. One never knows. The door opened to admit the chimney sweep, black as a sweep should be, carrying a soot-stained bundle. Nothing but old love letters, ma'am, he announced, and a bird's nest. House is clean as a whistle. Mrs. Bantry laughed until the tears came. The Pekingese, sensing excitement, barked once and subsided. Outside, the village went about its lawful occasions. The butcher's boy whistled on his bicycle, the church clock struck 10. A flight of starlings wheeled over the common. Miss Marple folded the primrose jacket and tied it with ribbon. I must finish my packing. The 11.47 will take me to town, and thence home. Mrs. Bantry protested. You can't go yet. There's the inquest, the reporters. My dear Dolly, I have no wish to appear in the Daily Mail. A quiet departure is best. Willowbrook will forget the footsteps by Christmas. Roofs will be roofs again, and the only midnight sounds the owls. She rose, serene and unhurried. In the hall, she paused to pin on her hat before the mirror. The grandfather clock showed 20 minutes to 11, time enough for a word with Mrs. Forsyth, a promise of discretion, a gentle hint that the past is best left to the chimney sweep. The pony trap waited at the door. Ted touched his cap. The cob stamped impatiently. Miss Marple climbed in, arranged her traveling rug, and looked back once at the house. The slates gleamed innocently in the pale sun. No print marred their frost. No shadow moved across the ridge. As the trap bowled down the lane, she opened her notebook for the last time and wrote beneath the final entry. Case closed. Motive: greed. Method: terror. Moral: the old paths are the surest, but they lead both ways. She closed the book, slipped it into her handbag beside the shortbread tin, and turned her face toward the station and home.